The film introduction contains several photographs of President Kennedy and President Johnson, addressing crowds, meeting with key leaders, and at work in their offices.
Hello, and welcome to the JFK and LBJ, The New Frontier.
A uniformed park ranger appears in front of a visual background of student protesters.
During these webisode series, we will be comparing JFK and LBJ and examining them from a human perspective. Today, we will focus on their education and calls to service, World War II. Today, we have Park Ranger Jonathan Streff from the John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historical Park. And then we have Park Ranger Joseph Owen from the Lyndon Johnson National Historical Park. I am Joy Kinard, and I'm the superintendent of the Central Alabama Civil Rights Sites. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Joey, how are you?
Good, and you?
I'm well, thanks for asking.
Hey, Joseph.
Hello.
So let's jump right into our discussion. So my first question is, how did the particulars of family, economic, and health shape the educational experiences of both men?
All right, I'll go ahead and jump in. Well, as we're all well aware, Jack Kennedy is going to be growing up at
a uniformed park ranger in front of a visual background of JFK's birthplace, a gray, three-story house with dark green shutters.
But in the world, so Jack Kennedy is growing up deep in the heart of privilege.
Black and white photo of three school buildings surrounding the Edward Devotion House.
He does start at a public school here in Brookline, and then also goes to a private school.
Black and white photo of young JFK in a football uniform.
To Choate in Connecticut, and then spend 1 year at Princeton and the other 3 years at Harvard University. The tough thing for Jack Kennedy, as we've talked about before, is this guy is ill. He's going to miss a lot of school. Many of us can relate to that in the time of COVID, of course, but Jack Kennedy, between nearly dying when he's about 3.5 years of age, he had scarlet fever. He also had colitis. By the time he's in his early 20s, he'll be diagnosed with something called Addison's disease, which compromises one's immune system, which helps to explain why he was so sick all the time. But he's going to miss significant amounts of school. And as a result of that, his academic record is pretty spotty. He's not a great student, but to his credit, what he's going to do is to read all the time. When he's ill, he'll be reading books, a lot of books of history, a lot of books of biography, fiction as well. So his mind is always working, and that becomes something that will be quite helpful to him as an adult and once he becomes involved in politics, and particularly the presidency.
Thank you, Jonathan. Joseph?
Well, Lyndon Johnson was
a uniformed park ranger sits in front of a blue-gray background with a wooden door and hanging picture frames.
Johnson City. So he had an interest in education early on. And then when he graduated from high school at the age of 16, he went then to Southwest Texas Teachers College, which is Texas.
Black and white photo of young Lyndon Johnson in a suit and bow tie.
But a significant event is when he became a principal of the Wellhausen School, which is south of San Antonio, Cotulla, Texas. He did not graduate from college yet. However, they wanted him to be a principal. So he was principal
Photograph,
for
1928, Lyndon B. Johnson with his first pupils.
His views on education. He saw that the students he were teaching, which were poor Mexican migrant students, was not getting a good quality education, and he had to pay for a lot of funding for himself out of his own pocket. And he really wanted, it really was an eye-opener for him with the quality of education. He knew that a poor school did not get as good quality education as they should have. And so he was really influenced with that. And also he was also influenced, he thought that since he got his degree from Southwest Texas Teachers College, it was not as important of a degree as, let's say, Oxford or Harvard. And so that's one thing that also influenced him, was trying to get a quality of education, because he was very mindful about that. He was very lucky he had a mother that was installing a value of education, as well as his father, Sam Jr. So his parents, his learning of the love of education at home, and then being a principal at a young age. He didn't graduate from college yet when he became a principal of a school in San Antonio for a term.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how did the real life interruptions augment their academic learning?
So as I was saying before, Jack Kennedy's going to be ill a lot, but also the fact, so obviously he will be dealing with a lot of life lessons, right? How to deal with pain, how to interact with physicians and nurses and healthcare providers. And he really sort of, I would argue, kind of develops a sense of charm, but also a sense of humor to kind of deal with all that as well. The other thing that's going to happen is that in 1938, his father will become ambassador to Great Britain. And so Jack Kennedy will actually take some time away from Harvard and spend a fair amount of time traveling through Europe and other parts of the world. And when he's doing this, obviously, it's a very important point in world history. You've got the rise of fascism. The Russian Revolution occurs in 1917. He'll visit the Soviet Union. He'll be in Germany as the Nazis are coming to power. He'll be in Italy. He'll go back to Ireland. And so I think for all of us, the more that we travel, the more we develop a wider worldview. It becomes much more difficult to hold biases or prejudices when you experience people who are different than you are, and you're able to sort of meet them where they are. And I think Kennedy is able to, and while he's doing all this traveling, he's writing things down. So again, you have these kind of teachable moments, as we say in education, where he's going into these situations and sort of writing these things down. And speaking of writing things down, his senior thesis will be Why England Slept. So talking about
colored photo of young JFK
essence,
sitting outside reading his first book, Why England Slept.
In the face of the Nazis rearming after the First World War. Now, obviously, he's going to have access to a lot of primary sources because of his father's connections, but to his credit, he'll use those. You'll also see with that publication a new form of education, in the sense that Kennedy's going to begin to move away from his father's political views, particularly his views of foreign policy. So you see this young man literally learning on the job, picking up information and applying it. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, being able to be pragmatic, being able to adapt to the new information that's coming at him and making choices.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Joseph?
Lyndon Johnson was very fortunate with education-wise. He didn't really have any bumps in the road of interruption that would affect him later on. He was able to transition smoothly from high school to college, but it was during the college years that he had a learning experiences that would affect his policies later, especially with the poor in education, with being a principal of a school when he was not even really qualified to be a principal of the school. However, there was a big influence on him. And later on, I think he would connect with education with the Great Society Act, because they were corresponding together. Without a good education, the opportunities to have a great society or good programs was a lot difficult more to achieve. But overall, Lyndon Johnson really did not have any kind of stumbling ground that would prevent him from having a good education. However, like I said, later on, his experiences as being a teacher and a principal at a school that didn't have much money, and for Mexican migrant children, that would really affect him later on, especially when he had the Great Society policies regarding public education and equal education for anybody who wanted to pursue a quality of education.
Joseph, I think you just answered the third question, which is, how did Johnson's own experiences as an educator shape or push his educational reform as president? So thank you so much for that. So my next question for the both of you is, how did each man come to join the service?
So I'll go ahead and start with that. I think what's kind of interesting is that these two things connect quite well together. Jack Kennedy is graduating from Harvard University.
Black and white photo of JFK in graduation robes.
Europe is already, and Asia are already at war, but the United States has yet to join. So both Joe Jr.
Black and white photo of JFK and Joe Jr. in their World War II military uniforms.
Will become a Navy flyer, and eventually Jack Kennedy is going to become a lieutenant commander of PT boats in the South Pacific. Now, as we've talked about before, this guy was not going to pass an Army physical or a Navy physical for that matter. So it's very helpful when you have, you're the son of an ambassador to kind of pave the way for you. But what's interesting is that at first, Jack Kennedy was in the Office of Naval Intelligence because Joe Kennedy, the father's biggest fear, he talks, there's this famous quote where he says, "I've given 9 hostages to fortune." His biggest fear about war coming would be that he would lose one of his children. So he's trying to make sure that his kids are not in active combat duty. But Jack wants to make sure that that happens. So long story short, what ends up happening is Jack gets bored working at a desk in Washington, and he works with his grandfather, who had connections to a senator in Massachusetts, to get him command in the South Pacific. Jack Kennedy will have an experience in 1943 where his PT boat, which are basically kind of small motorboats.
Black and white photo of JFK and PT-109 crew standing aboard the PT-109 in 1943.
Right away when the ship basically split in two. But Jack Kennedy sprung into action. He was a 37-year-old crew member named Pappy McMahon who was wounded, but Jack Kennedy was able to take the strings from his life preserver, put them in his teeth, and swim to nearby islands. So for the better part of 6 days, he's able to keep his crew alive. Eventually, they'll find an indigenous person in the Solomon Islands, and he will
photo of the coconut with the PT-109 rescue message in the Oval Office.
Will hand that to Australian intelligence, and then they'll be rescued. Eventually, Jack Kennedy will be awarded the Navy Cross and a Purple Heart because he was wounded. But he was, typical JFK style. He said he was not a war hero. It was completely involuntary. They sank my boat was the quote that he often used.
Wow, I did not know that. Joseph?
Well, with Lyndon Johnson, he had a very brief career in the naval service. He joined the Naval Reserve in 1940. 2 days after the attack of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was on December 7th, 1941. On December
photograph
9th,
of LCDR, Lyndon D. Johnson,
requested an indefinite leave of absence. And so he was in the active Naval Reserve. He was also a favorite of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So President Roosevelt had LBJ be his eyes and ears in the Southwest Pacific. He wanted to know what was going on truthfully. He didn't feel like he was getting all the truth from all the admirals and generals that he should have gotten. So he sent Lyndon Johnson to go out there to New Guinea, to go to Douglas MacArthur and find out what was going on, if everything was being told truthfully, and if supplies were getting out there adequately. One significant event in Lyndon Johnson's brief naval service is he was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He was going to be on a B-26 bomber called the Wabash Cannonball, and the plane was delayed on takeoff. President Johnson had to take a short break, and when he came back to go on the plane, well, his seat was filled by a good friend of his. Well, the plane, the Wabash Cannonball, never came back. It was shot down by Japanese aircraft. So what Lyndon Johnson did, he didn't know about what was happening, but he went on another B-26 called the Heckling Hare. And he was there for an observer to see, what was going on with the Japanese, what was going on with the B-26 and how it was doing. Well, the plane got electrical problems, and so it wasn't able to complete the mission. But on the way back to President Johnson's home base, it was attacked by Japanese Zeros. And it was, according to a report, it was shred to pieces. However, they were able to land safely. Well, General Douglas MacArthur knew that Lyndon Johnson was an important senator. He knew he was the eyes and ears of President Roosevelt. So he awarded Lyndon Johnson the Silver Star. And Lyndon Johnson himself said, "I don't know if I deserve this award." But Douglas MacArthur, 4 or 5-star general, when he gives out an award, is not challenged. And so he was awarded the Silver Star, and some of his fellow crew members on board the Heckling Hare were resentful. They said, "How come we didn't get an award and he did?" Well, the truth is he was an important senator. General MacArthur knew that Lyndon Johnson was very influential in Congress with money, with appropriations, and with Franklin Roosevelt. So even though Lyndon Johnson didn't think he received that he should have gotten the Silver Star. Interestingly, he always wore the Silver Star lapel pin on his collar for the rest of his life when he was in a business suit. It'd be right there on his suit collar. And so even though his service was brief, he did, rightfully or not, get the Silver Star.
I had no idea. Thanks for sharing that with us, Joseph. You know, as I share this last question with you all, I just can't help but to think about the Tuskegee Airmen here in Tuskegee, Alabama, and their major contributions to World War II, and just thinking about these presidents and so many things that were going on during that time, during their war years, just resonates with me today, right now. And so I wanted to ask you this last question. How did their wartime experiences shape the characters of both men?
Yeah, and just to connect, Joy, with what you're getting at a moment ago, I think World War II is a game changer. And I would argue, especially as you were sort of hinting at with the civil rights movement, right?
It does.
The double victory
Yes.
campaign,
Yes.
the folks fighting against fascism at home and then fighting
Yes.
pro at home. Now, we'll talk later on about civil rights. And I think,
Yes.
but I think for many folks who experience combat, but also are leaving the confines of their normal life, it's going to change them drastically. Some of those folks will develop PTSD and they'll carry that with them. Other folks develop a new sense of self and a new sense of drive to sort of change the world that they live in. I think that's true of Black veterans post-World War II. And I think it's also true of Jack Kennedy as well. He's 29 years of age when he leaves the military, and it's a brand new world. 28 years of age. And he nearly died, as we sort of talked about a few moments ago. And I think if you look at his letters in the post-World War II period, here is a young man whose worldview has been shaken. He'll also lose his older brother 1 year later after the incident in PT 109. And then his sister Kathleen will die in a plane crash, not related to the war, of course, in 1948. But that sense that life is fragile will become that much more apparent to him. I also think it makes him, he will re-injure his back. He'll come home with malaria and he will not be looking great in 45 and 46. It reinforces his interest in public service, his time in the war. Again, he can relate to Lyndon Johnson, both as veterans of the Pacific Theater, right? Along with other members of the House and the Senate once he becomes involved there. Simultaneously, though, I think it helps him develop a skeptical, somewhat skeptical feelings about military leadership and military brass and being able to think for oneself, all of which will come in handy, particularly during the crisis moments of his presidency.
Thank you so much. Joseph?
Well, with Lyndon Johnson, he had two sides of the coin. He was in the Senate. He was part of the Appropriations Committee. He knew what needed to be go to fight effectively. But he also knew that he needed to get the right reports from generals and admirals to the president. So when he was president, he think he understood what was needed to be given to the troops. In Vietnam,
colored photo of LBJ awarding a Distinguished Service Cross to a lieutenant's collar in Ka Ram Bay, South Vietnam, 1966.
Than he would do with Vietnam. But more to the point about military service with Lyndon Johnson, his son-in-law, Chuck Robb, who was a former governor and senator of Virginia, was in the United States Marines as a captain. He married Linda Johnson, the president's oldest daughter. We have a famous photo of Lyndon Johnson at his
black and white photo of
House
LBJ in the White House cabinet room, listening to tape sent by Captain Charles Robb, United States Marine Corps from Vietnam, 1968.
The anguish that Lyndon Johnson had listening to his son-in-law's reports. Also, Lucy Johnson was married, her first husband was Patrick Nugent, who was also in the military, in the Air Force, and he went overseas. And so I believe the experiences of his son-in-laws probably influenced him more than actually when he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy. But I believe it was more of his personal experience with his son-in-laws that he got to understand Vietnam a lot better than he would have. And it really did affect him towards the last part of his presidency, 1968, with the Tet Offensive. And so it was his son-in-laws that really helped him develop an idea of how bad Vietnam was. And like I said, when he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy, he was a personal representative of Franklin Roosevelt. He understood the supplies that were needed. He understood the influences of Congress to get supplies taken to where they were needed the most. And so as president, he was able to talk to General William Westmoreland and say, what do you need to fight this war, fight this conflict? Because Lyndon Johnson himself knew, he saw the reports from World War II about what was needed and how influential generals and admirals were to get the policies done.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Well, guys, we are out of time. Join us for the next episode on Two Congressmen and Two Senators, the legislative years. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Credit slides of white text on a black background roll, identifying and thanking those who appeared in the video and those who helped edit and produce the video series.